The time has come for the Cobra to rise up and reveal himself.
Let's take a look at our second and third graphs of the banking system, the market for loanable funds graph and the investment demand graph. Now, these are the inner workings of the more macro level money market graph. And the money market graph is showing the wide-ranging effects on the banking system and the money supply. The purpose of these two graphs is to show more in particular how banks themselves are affected and then how this affects the ability and willingness of people and businesses to get loans. So first let's start with the market for loanable funds graph. Here we have another supply and demand graph, this one for the supply and demand of loanable funds. And when we say loanable funds, what we really mean is excess reserves, because excess reserves become the loanable funds, money the bank has to loan. And so our graph, we have the real interest rate, because now we are focused on why people keep their money in the bank versus why people will borrow money. And we have the quantity of loanable funds. And equilibrium is where the real interest rate equals the quantity of loanable funds, where the quantity supplied of loanable funds equals the quantity demanded at this real interest rate. So let's take a look at the supply and demand, and then we'll see how the first graph, the money market graph, when the Federal Reserve shifts the money supply, how it affects this graph. First, let's start with supply. Supply of loanable funds is the amount of excess reserves in the banking system. And the supply, where does that money come from? Well, it represents the ability and willingness of people to put their money in the bank. And so it's the ability and willingness to save. As interest rates are low, as we said before with money demand, very similar to money demanded, as interest rates are low, people are less inclined to put their money in the bank. And we see there is a low amount of quantity supplied of loanable funds. However, as interest rates increase, there is a greater quantity supplied of loanable funds. This shows us that as the interest rates are higher, that offers more of a return for assets in the bank, and so people will keep their money in the bank. So an increase in quantity supplied of loanable funds. And so the real interest rate represents, just like money demanded, it represents the opportunity cost of, do you keep your money in the bank or do you keep your money as cash? So it's really it's very similar to the money market graph in that it shows the relationship and the opportunity cost of the real interest rate to keeping our money in the bank. Real interest rate is low. We may as well keep our money as cash. There's less of an opportunity cost, or as a checking account with a lower or not any nominal lower interest rate. Or if the real interest rate is high, well then the opportunity cost is higher to keep our money as cash, so therefore there will be more money in the bank. So the supply represents the amount of excess reserves or loanable funds in the bank, and it's directly related to the interest rate. Do we as households want to put our money in the bank, or are we okay holding that money as cash? And it shifts due to monetary policy, because the Federal Reserve can also, especially with open market operations, directly inject or remove money from the banking system, loanable funds and excess reserves. Personal savings, regardless of interest rates, do we want to keep our money in the bank or take it out? Foreign direct investment, do foreign nations want to put their money in American banks or vice versa, based on the comparative interest rates? And also post-borrowing, the after effects of borrowing. If all of a sudden there was massive borrowing in the banking system, this would be a shift to the left of the supply curve. So post-borrowing is always a shift left. And before we show how monetary policy would play out, let's take a look at the other half of that, which is the demand for loanable funds. And it sounds way fancier than it is. The demand for loanable funds just means our ability and willingness to borrow. If the interest rates are high, we are less willing to borrow because that's extra money that now be careful about interest rates. Remember, interest rates can either work for us or against us depending on the situation. So from the supply of loanable funds perspective, this is the interest rate working for us, putting our money in banks. And low interest rate, that's less compound interest for us. High interest rate, that's more compound interest for our assets in the bank. Demand, however, is the opposite perspective. This is demand of loanable funds. What does demand of loanable funds mean? That means, do we want to borrow funds from the bank? So demand of loanable funds literally means our ability and willingness to borrow, our desire to borrow. So here, you have to flip perspectives of the interest rate. This is the real interest rate working against us as borrowers. And if the real interest rate is high, we will be less inclined to borrow money. If we're going to buy a home, you wouldn't want to take out a mortgage of hundreds of thousands of dollars at a higher interest rate. You'd be more inclined to wait for the interest rate to come down. And at a lower interest rate, the quantity demanded of loanable funds would increase. At the lower interest rate, people would be more inclined to borrow. You'd be more inclined to take out a massive mortgage with hundreds of thousands of dollars at the lower interest rate because that's less interest that we are paying back. So be careful about the interest rate, and remember, perspectives of the interest rate flip. The supply of loanable funds and excess reserves, that the interest rate is working for us and our assets in the bank and as our store of value of money in M2. And with demand of loanable funds, this is the real interest rate as the opportunity cost to borrow. High interest rate, very high opportunity cost. That's more money we have to pay back, especially because the real interest rate is already adjusted for inflation. And the lower the interest rate is, the lower the opportunity cost. And demand shifts for the act of borrowing. Very straightforward. If either consumers, government, or businesses want to borrow money, there would be an increase in demand, a shift in demand to the right. And this graph we're also going to come back to when this is also the main graph of the crowding out effect, which we're going to see in our next unit what happens when the government borrows money to deficit spend. So we're going to come back to this graph in our next unit. But while we're talking about borrowing, we're the biggest borrower. While the federal government can borrow tons of money, the main type of constant borrower and the biggest borrower is businesses, our businesses, which is investment spending. So our little graph over here is what is called the investment demand graph. And it's really straightforward, and it just shows that investment spending, remember, investment spending is when businesses borrow money, when businesses spend on capital resources. And how do they spend $10 million on refurbishing a factory or $20 million on building a new factory? They usually have to borrow money. So what the investment demand graph shows is, again, the opportunity cost to borrow money. So it's really a re-emphasis of this concept, but just focused on investment spending. And so it shows that the higher the interest rate, the higher the opportunity cost of businesses to borrow money, and there would be a low quantity of investment spending, versus the lower the interest rate, less opportunity cost for businesses to borrow money. Now it's way easier, way less opportunity cost, way less money paid back at $10 to $20 million, if not more. And you have a higher quantity of investment spending. And again, both of these graphs we're going to see play out. Well, what happens when the government borrows massive sums of money and the side effects that has on the entire banking system and the economy. And that's in our next unit, which is the side effects of fiscal and monetary policy. But first, let's take a look now. So we have our three graphs of the banking system. We have our money market graph, we have our market for loanable funds, and we have kind of the inner workings of the market for loanable funds, which is the investment demand graph. You're never going to have to draw this graph, but do know that investment demand and businesses borrowing money for capital resources is the biggest borrower in the economy and a major part of the inner workings of the demand of loanable funds. So let's just play out and how all of these graphs would work together in an expansionary monetary policy. An expansionary monetary policy was, we drew in our last graph, would shift money supply to the right. Let's say buying bonds. All right, the most direct monetary policy. Federal Reserve buys bonds to put money into the banking system to encourage borrowing. So how does this encourage borrowing? Well, let's take a look. Now, the supply, main shift, one of the main shifts, monetary policy, the supply of loanable funds has now increased because the Federal Reserve bought bonds from the banks, and in exchange for those bonds, gave the banks a lot of money, a lot of excess reserves, which become loanable funds. So now, the supply of loanable funds increases. As the banks have more money, they will lower the nominal interest rate and lower the real interest rate as a signal to people who want to borrow that, hey, we have excess reserves, come borrow from us. So the real interest rate decreases, and this increases the quantity of the ability and willingness to borrow. So as supply increases, banks have more money to loan. What happens? We see an increase in the quantity of loanable funds demanded. Lower interest rates equals more people, movement along the demand curve, showing you that with the interest rates coming down, more people are willing to borrow money. Specifically, more businesses, because as the real interest rate decreases in this graph, it's the same banking system, the real interest rate decreases in the investment demand graph, and we see here, as the real interest rate decreases, the quantity of investment spending increases. So now, our graphs visualize the full monetary policy process, but graphically, right? Everything we laid out for why the Federal Reserve does monetary policy and how that increases aggregate demand from recession or will decrease aggregate demand from inflation. We see it now in the money market graph, and as the nominal interest rates and money supply in the money market graph change, we also see the inner workings of the banking system in the market for loanable funds graph and also in the investment demand graph. Remember, graphs are a visualization of the entire process. Our previous lessons laid out this process, and now we see that process happen. Increase in the money supply, shift to the right of the money supply, is a shift to the right of the supply of excess reserves in the banking system, which become loanable funds, which, as the bank has more excess reserves, real interest rate comes down. As the real interest rate decreases, there's that increase in the ability and willingness to borrow, because the opportunity cost to borrow decreases, and we see that kind of re-echoed here in the investment demand curve. Real interest rate comes down, quantity of investment demand increases. And of course, the reverse of all of this would happen as well if the Federal Reserve shifted the money supply to the left. We would see a leftward shift of supply of loanable funds, which would raise interest rates, which would decrease investment spending and decrease overall borrowing and spending in the economy, shifting aggregate demand back to the left. So we see with all of these graphs the effectiveness of monetary policy, how the broad action by the Federal Reserve permeates through and slithers through the banking system, affecting the nominal interest rate, the real interest rate. We also have the federal funds rate, the rate banks are lending to each other changing, and then as all of those interest rate changes, ultimately the ability and willingness to borrow and the ability and willingness to investment spend changes, and thus aggregate demand changes. It is complex, but the banking system is much more complex than the circular flow model, which is why Keynes criticizes the non-direct nature of monetary policy versus fiscal policy. But it also shows that monetary policy is quite effective at changing the banking system, the interest rates, and the ability and willingness to borrow and investment spend. Thank you for watching. Remember, whether it is your money, your mind, or your body, invest hard, invest often, and no feelings. Money never sleeps. We'll see you next time.